This lecture is going to talk a little bit more about graphs that are used in marketing. So the way to think about this is that really there's going to be two main types of findings that you're going to be presenting. And this corresponds to some of the research designs that we talked about back in week 1. So remember, there are 3 research designs: exploratory, where you're seeking out insights and hypotheses, and there's descriptive and causal. So you can present the results or the findings that are purely descriptive. So descriptive findings describe something. For example, we could say, if this were a medical study, a medical report, the patient's blood pressure is something. Okay, it's just a descriptive fact. We could say that X% of our customers have mobile devices. That's a descriptive fact. If we're public policy researchers, well, maybe 40% of the population favors a certain government policy. That's a descriptive fact, as opposed to a causal finding. So causal findings will imply a relationship. So causal relationships are such that we have some dependent variable, and we want to see how this dependent variable depends on independent variables. So this is a relationship. Now, if you think back to the descriptive findings, if 40% care about a certain policy, well, how does that, whether you favor that policy relate to whether you're going to vote for my candidate? So whether you favor a policy, and whether that implies you're going to vote for a candidate would be a causal finding. Okay, so if I believe strongly about some policy, then I'm going to vote for this guy. Otherwise, if I don't like that policy, I'll vote for the other guy. All right. So that gets us into a causal situation. Now, with causal studies, there are really 2 types of independent variables. These 2 types are either under your control or out of your control, but they both cause Y. So let's say that Y is our sales. Clearly, our sales are going to be affected by stuff that's under our control, like marketing. So if I change my price, my sales will change as well. I raise my price, chances are sales go down. Advertising. So I know we're not allowed to use the 4 Ps at IMC, but I'm talking about the 4 Ps here. So if I advertise more, hopefully my sales go up, if my advertising is effective. The way I position the product, the way I design the product itself, all of these things are under my control and they affect sales. It'll also be affected by other stuff, like what the competition is doing, what weather's like. So if it's very hot out, I bet ice cream sales go up. If it gets cold out, our ice cream sales go down, and so forth. All right, so causal relationships are extremely important. If I had to constrain myself to giving only one word of advice on getting to graphical excellence, I would say look for relationships. Show causal relationships. I pulled a couple quotes. So this is from a book by Sen and Srivastava. Perception of relationships is the cornerstone of civilization. By understanding how certain phenomena depend on others, we learn to predict the consequences of our actions and to manipulate our environment. And so it's not just marketing where this is true. This is true about everything. And this is what has led the human race to advance, is by understanding relationships, by being able to predict the consequences of our actions. So it's equally true in marketing. Here's what Tufte has to say about it. Relational graphics are absolutely essential to competent statistical analysis, since they confront statements about cause and effect with evidence, showing how one variable really affects another. So I like to think of a hierarchy of good graphics in marketing. essentially. So these aren't just purely narrative ones like Napoleon's March. So the ultimate question that I ask myself when I look at a graph is, what's the client going to do now that they know whatever's on my graph? Right? And if the answer to that question is, no, the graph doesn't tell me to do anything, it's probably a pretty boring graph. So here's my hierarchy. Above all else, seek to show causal relationships. The theme of this lecture, one of the headlines is, show how the outcomes you're trying to achieve depend on the things that are under your control. All right. Purely descriptive graphs have some value, perhaps, if you can tell a story around them. Usually not as interesting as a causal graph. Graphs over time have some value, but time's usually not a fundamental cause. It's usually a proxy for other things. So if I just show how sales change over time, maybe that's interesting, but what time is really probably showing is the effects of seasonality or the effects of some new marketing program. So don't use time if you actually have data on the actual causal factor. Univariate descriptive snapshots are usually not very actionable at all. All right, so one other thing, you want to focus on outcomes, not outputs. So what's the difference between an outcome and an output? Outputs are things that you do. So if we buy 20,000 banner ads today, that's an output. If I have 10 events today, that's an output. If I show X number of ads, that's an output. If I send out 250,000 emails today, that's an output. That's not very interesting. What you really care about are the outcomes. So what happens as a consequence of me sending out emails? Well, let's look at response rate. How many customers have I acquired because of these marketing efforts? Right, so focus on these outcomes rather than the stuff that you do. Nobody really cares about the stuff you do, or they shouldn't care. They should care about what happens as a consequence. If you're spending a bunch of money on advertising that's ineffective, just telling people I spent a bunch of money on advertising, the output, is not very informative. So what happened as a consequence, that's the outcome. All right, so let's take a look at the second bullet. So purely descriptive graphs over time have some value. So let's say that my dashboard tells me that my market share is 20% during month 10. So this is good or bad? The answer is I don't know. Okay, so adding a time series around this will make it much more informative. So let's take a look at this top graph. Notice I have a 20% share at time period 10, but look what's happening. So over time, my sales are going down. All right, so simply adding this, context of where we were last month brings a lot more information to that number, 20%. Now that's an entirely different story than the one I show down here, where notice I have a 20% share at period 10, but my market share is increasing. Okay, so providing that little bit of context of where we're coming from is very important. Now an even better graph would be something like this. Now notice I have a 20% share at period 10. However, my share has been kind of constant since this line back in period 5 when I introduced the new ad campaign. So now I can start to conclude that this new ad campaign that I developed is really pretty effective, since it took me from about a 14 or 15 share up to a 20 share. Okay, so again, seek to show causal relationships, then you can demonstrate the effectiveness of your advertising or your marketing. All right, well, how are we going to study relationships? So I said, if I can give you one word of advice, study relationships. So quantify the dependence of one variable by studying how it depends on others. This table kind of outlines the rest of this class and your next class in statistics. So between this class and the next, you're going to cover all these methods. So it all depends on the measurement levels. So if the dependent variable is going to be categorical and you have an independent variable that's categorical, we're going to use crosstabs. So for example, how does the banner ad, so maybe I have 3 banner ads, banner ad A, B, or C, depend on or affect whether or not a person clicks yes or no. So click yes or no is a categorical dependent variable. Banner ad's a categorical predictor variable. We'll use crosstabs. So we're going to talk about that today. Another possibility is that you've got a numerical dependent variable like sales, and I've got a categorical independent variable. So which of my 3 banner ads affect sales the most? Well, we can use compare means. We'll talk about box plots. We'll talk about the independent sample t-test and so forth. Next quarter, you're going to spend a lot of time in this lower box where you talk about logistic regression and normal regression, linear regression, and so forth. All right, so that's it for this video. We'll come back and do the next